Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second of the Society for Socialist Studies occasional Zoom panels. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm the president of the Society for Socialist Studies, and I am a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Before we begin our exciting new panel, I would just like to take a couple of minutes to tell you a bit about the SSS and how you can be involved and bring others into the SSS. First, I would like to begin by pointing out for our academic colleagues that 2021 has turned out to be our second year without being part of Congress. This time, it's because we have withdrawn from Congress in support of the Black Canadian Studies Association's withdrawal from Congress after a year of disappointing negotiations designed to address the matter of anti-Black racism in the academy, which erupted in a very unpleasant way, if you remember, in the 2019 Society for Socialist Studies Congress. So I know, and we on the executive are all aware that this has been disappointing to many. And we would like to say that we do not intend to remain out of Congress forever or anything. On the contrary, we have already started efforts to work with other organizations that have either boycotted this year's Congress or are at least supporting and expressing their support for the demands of the Black Canadian Studies Association. And we hope that we can essentially change Congress and remain within it. Secondly, I just wanted to say a couple of things about the fact that recently the Society for Socialist Studies has opened a path to opening chapters and affiliations as a way of both expanding membership, but also making the Society for Socialist Studies a network that joins socialist scholarship with socialist activism. And of course, as you know, we define socialism extremely broadly to cover all the feminist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, ecological, of course, and other such issues. So if you are part of or know an activist organization that should be part of such a network, or if you are planning some socialist activities, you can perhaps consider starting a chapter. So the forms, there are very simple forms that you can fill in on the society website under membership. And of course, Megan Aiken, who is our membership secretary, and I are available to answer any questions that you may have. But please help us in this project. Please help us expand the reach of the society and make it truly a pan-Canadian network for socialist activism and socialist scholarship. So now, thank you very much. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Chris Hurl and Ben Christensen to present this wonderful panel that they have organized. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Radhika, for getting us started here. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Struggle Against Free Trade in Canada panel hosted by the Society of Socialist Studies. We're just really happy that you can join us today. And my name is Benjamin Christensen. I teach sociology at Douglas College out in BC, New Westminster, and my colleague Chris Hurl is a sociologist at Concordia University, and we're really excited to be hosting this event. Before we get started, I would first just like to thank Sandra, Radhika, Sean, and Megan, who have been working hard in the background to make this event happen, along with the launch of the special issue, which I believe is being launched today online. And so thanks so much for that work behind the scenes, everyone. Okay, so to get things started, I'm just going to provide a little bit of context about how this project began. And then we are going to jump into our guest presentations. So this project began for Chris and I back in 2018, when Donald Trump was forcing Canada and Mexico to renegotiate NAFTA. And as we were watching these negotiations unfold, it seemed to us that the left-leaning progressive anti-free trade movement of the 1980s was not present during the lead up to the renegotiation of NAFTA. It also seemed to us that right-wing populists such as Donald Trump and others were taking up the mantle of opposing free trade and attempting to represent working class workers' interests. So for us, the question became, well, what has changed and why? So to kickstart this project, back in 2019, Chris and I organized a roundtable session at the 2019 Congress conference of the Society for Socialist Studies, reflecting the 30th year anniversary of the signing of the Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect on January 1st, 1989. So this special issue is really building on this discussion. And for this special issue, we've invited Bill Carroll, Marjorie Cohen, Claude Valancourt, and Paul Kellogg to contribute to this issue. And we invited these contributors with two aims in mind for this special issue. First, to remember the coalitions that formed in opposition and how these coalitions were organized back in the 1980s. And then secondly, drawing from this history to make sense of how things have changed over the past 30 plus years. And importantly, we've asked, how can those on the left effectively confront the project of free trade today, while at the same time challenging both far-right nationalism and neoliberal globalization? So that's kind of the background for this project and this special issue. So I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to my colleague, Chris Hurrell.
Thanks, Ben. My job is to introduce the speakers, but I could tell from the participants that most of you probably are aware of who the speakers are, so I'll just be very brief. So we have four contributors to our special issue. We have Marjorie Griffin Cohen, who is a feminist economist, professor emeritus of political science, gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Simon Fraser University, written extensively on issues of political economy and very, very active in the anti-free trade movement, co-chair of the Coalition Against Free Trade in Toronto, co-chair of the National Coalition of the Pro-Canada Network. And her chapter in the special issue does a fantastic job of just documenting all of the early organizing that was taking place at the time. Also serving as the executive of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and of course speaking to the very central place of NAC in the anti-free trade organizing. Our second speaker, Paul Kellogg, is a professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Athabasca University in Edmonton, Alberta, and written extensively on free trade and globalization issues. I just wanted to give a shout out to his most recent book, Escape from the Staples Trap, published in 2015. And building from this, his chapter speaks to critique of left nationalism and how it's played out in the early free trade struggles. Next, we have Bill Carroll, professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Victoria, founding director of UVic's interdisciplinary program in social justice studies, published extensively on the changing shape of corporate power and the capitalist class, and most recently spearheaded the corporate mapping project, where he set out to map corporate power in Canada with a focus on the petroleum industry. And finally, we have Claude Valancourt, who is president of Attaque Quebec. He's an essayist and novelist and member of the editorial collective of the magazine Ababor, and much of his writing focuses on culture, economics, and criticism of the neoliberal system. So we're lucky to have all of these speakers here today to get into remembering.
No. I'm like the sound one.
Oh, somebody is.
what you're talking
The
about.
one on. Okay.
Can you mute your microphone, David?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to get started. And in terms of process, we think it would be the smoothest if we first heard from all of our speakers. So we'll have Marjorie speak first, then Paul, then Bill, then Claude. And then we're going to open things up for a Q&A. So please save your questions for the end. And as Megan mentioned at the end, we'll take questions through chat, or if you raise your hand, we can take it through audio. Yeah, we'll get started. So maybe Marjorie, you can take us away.
Well, first, I would like to thank Chris Hurrell and Benjamin Christensen for organizing us into a panel at Congress 2 years ago. and making sure that we wrote out our thoughts for articles and publication in Socialist Studies. And I believe this will happen very soon. And I also want to thank Socialist Studies for putting this Zoom event together. It's nice to see people I haven't seen in over a year. So that's lovely too. You know, it's tempting right now to talk about the impact of free trade on globalization. And I won't do that for very long, but it does seem we have to point out that today's form of globalization is based largely on an unregulated international market system that was dramatically accelerated by the free trade agreements. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was the first comprehensive free trade agreement, and that paved the way for all the subsequent ones that developed, and now they're huge, huge numbers. So now what we have is a world of uncontrolled international monopolies. We have dire austerity and countries' public policy in order to limit, and the whole point of that austerity is to limit wages and taxes, all in the name of being more competitive. And now we know that Canada is actually below the OECD average in spending on social programs. It's even worse in the United States. So that's really saying something. So we've also seen very vast surges in unequal wealth. It was easy for us to see it coming when we were organized against free trade. All of the predictions of the anti-free trade movement of the 1980s actually came through, although there were a couple of things we got wrong. I think there were probably more than two, but one important was we didn't understand how dramatically and comprehensively this would be. But most significantly, we did not anticipate the rise in the right-wing national fanaticism in the United States that accelerated as the consequences of free trade there were felt. But today I want to talk about the movement against free trade because it was a unique moment in Canada. And these are the main points I'd like to sort of highlight in what I have to say. The anti-free trade movement in Canada was a genuine movement and that it moved and that originated locally throughout the country and was joined together in loose coalitions, both at provincial and national levels, but it was a nationwide movement. Secondly, it was a movement that was based on class issues and it was understood by participants in that way. Third, it democratized knowledge and thinking about economic policy. Groups that were normally absent from these debates became actually central to research and action. I think specifically of women, but all other kinds of groups too. And the fourth is that this increased knowledge capability over time led to more widespread critiques of the market system itself, not initially with the beginnings of the anti-free trade movement, but certainly as more was known, it was the market system itself that became crucial. Altogether, the anti-free trade movement lost the 1988 election and free trade agreements now proliferate around the world. But it was a very significant movement because of the way it propelled masses of people to deal with the formative economic issues that had been until then in the hands of business, mainstream economists, and a select few in governments. We were asked when we were doing this 2 years ago, and also in our writing, to talk about our own personal involvement. I had two formal positions in the anti-free trade movement. Initially, I was chair of the Coalition Against Free Trade in Toronto. That began late 1985. And later co-chair of the National Coalition, the Pro-Canada Network, which began in 1987. But my main connection to the issue was through the feminist movement and my research on women and labor. That was when I was vice president and treasurer of the National Action Committee on the status of women. Now, in Toronto, the anti-free trade group was actually initiated by Laurel Ritchie, who was part of the Canadian Chemical and Textiles Workers Union. And it's important that that union was independent Canadian union. Most unions in Canada at that time were not. Most were affiliates of American unions, but they were a part of the Canadian Federation, the Confederation of Canadian Unions, the CCU. And so what happened is that they brought everybody together, including the trade unions that were part of the CLC. And we all met at the offices of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, because basically we were neutral ground and they all felt comfortable being there. It was the first coalition in the country. And at the first meeting, we had 35 groups represented, and that expanded to about 55 over time. And if you look at my article in Socialist Studies, which is coming out soon, you can see all of the groups that were represented. I also researched and wrote about free trade, and I can tell you more about that, but the crucial one was probably a review that I did for policy options on the McDonald Commission report, and I did that from a feminist perspective. And this was the huge 1,000-page report that basically showed Canada why free trade was going to be so important for it. And that's changed Brian Mulroney's mind. He had run against free trade, but then once that came out, they went wholeheartedly for it. So that's what happened. The activities and the extent of the free trade movement were quite extraordinary. One of the advantages we had is that we had a lengthy time period to deal with the issue. Prime Minister Mulroney announced his support in 1984, and the election didn't occur till 1988. But we had time to learn things and figure out things. But the two main questions for action for us, first was what was the scope of the agreement, and the second, what was the potential for stopping it. And so we trying to find out what was being negotiated and what was going to be included, it was extraordinarily difficult. The government, actually, we saw a leaked document that said their official policy, that was the less the public knew about this, the more likely it wasn't going to be against it. So that was their official policy. So we had no knowledge of what was actually going to be. And initially, the whole thought was that it was going to be reductions in tariffs, and therefore it would affect the manufacturing sector mostly. But of course, we increasingly learned that it was going to be the services sector as well, and that there were going to be all kinds of things that were going to affect virtually every aspect of Canadian life. But we had to develop sophisticated analysis over the implications of free trade for all aspects of life and the economy. And then, of course, we had to organize political opposition to it. I would say that the clash over free trade was the closest Canada has come to class war in the 20th century. The lines were really drawn between the Conservative Party and big business interests, which were aligned, and almost everybody else. And new alliances were formed in the anti-free trade movement. It was interesting, and it was the first time groups with often diverse objectives and political approaches worked together. And these actually were ties that were long-standing and still have the remnants of them today. And almost everybody understood that free trade is about empowering corporations through deregulation, privatization, and massive market expansion. And that the rules were basically going to be rules that were the rules of the international agreements. Don't focus on the corporations that are behaving internationally. They focus on what governments can do. And so it was a Bill of Rights for these corporations, basically. So at the national level, the anti-free trade movement included all of the affiliated trade unions of the CLC and the CCU, the 585 women's organizations represented by NAC. Actually, this was a very important point for the women's movement because it was the first time we became involved in a very large scale on macroeconomic issues. So that was important. And then there were the social justice arms of the churches, like the Anglican United and Catholic Church, the farmers in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, anti-poverty organizations, Indigenous people, immigrant groups, peace groups. It's social service groups, arts groups. And that was all very important. There was one other organization nationally called the Council of Canadians that began early, actually, in 1985. And that also had national chapters, but that was somewhat different. Initially, it became very large and effective, but initially it seemed to be more tied to the liberals, whereas our other groups were absolutely not affiliated with any political party. The activities around the country were varied and extensive over that period of time. And there was a lot of attempt to engage the public, to be visible on the media and so on. I traveled around the country on most weekends to various kinds of events, but in Toronto, I was most active on the ground. And I'll give you, in Toronto, the arts community had a huge impact on the kinds of things that we did. I'll give you an example. There was an anti-free trade review in 1986 that was bringing together the arts community and what they referred to as the politicos. And that was in Massey Hall. And this held 3,000 people, and it was filled. There were people waiting outside. And they had entertainers like the Royal Canadian Air Force, which I don't think exists anymore, but it was then, they were the masters of ceremony, and others like Sylvia Tyson, Eric Peterson, Erica Ritter, Lillian Allen. And then they would perform, and they would be interspersed with 2 minutes from the politicos. They were people like Walter Gordon, Ursula Franklin, David Suzuki, Bob White. I spoke at that one too. The first time I'd ever spoken to 3,000 people. Other arts initiatives included the logo, which became, I don't know if you can see this, but it's an American flag that has a maple leaf on it, and it says no, A. And we made a lot of money on that. That was on t-shirts, it was logo. It basically funded what we did in the Toronto group. And there was also a comic book. I don't know if some of you may remember, it was called What's the Big Deal? And this was written by journalist Rick Salutin and illustrated by Montreal cartoonist Terry Mosher. And it came out right before the election, and it explained what the issues were. It was distributed throughout the country and also translated into French. So the activities at the national level really focused on getting information. By 1987, the government was lying low. They weren't putting anything out. The media lost interest, and they accepted the notion it wasn't going to happen. And we thought this was a ruse. So a bunch of us from the Pro-Canada Network went to Washington, D.C. in July 1987 to talk to people in Congress and the trade union movement. And it became very clear that trade union movement said, by the way, we did not really have allies in this, either a little bit in the trade union movement, certainly not the feminist movement in the United States. The trade unions, we had a lot of allies in Mexico when NAFTA was trying to be organized, but not at this particular time. They were not particularly interested in it. But basically what we learned, that it was a done deal. The only holdup was that they were still trying to get more out of Canada. So there was basically no one in Congress against it. We learned an enormous amount. And when we got back, I contacted Linda McQuaig, who was at that time at the Globe and Mail. And she wrote a story, and that made front page headlines. And then we were all back on a roll again. So in addition to getting information, getting it out across the country was a major challenge. This was long before the internet, which I know is hard to imagine today, now that we're on Zoom day in and day out. But a lot had to be done by central organizations. An enormous amount was done by trade unions and also local groups. It's hard to convey the amount of activity that happened throughout the country. Most of the accounts that I've seen of the anti-free trade movement focused on what happened in Ottawa, but that's really not even the main story of what was going on. And the center did not direct the very diverse activities that happened everywhere. Another thing that was very important for the anti-free trade movement was the research that we did. Whenever one read about free trade in newspapers or government reports, they would almost always begin with something that says like, all economists agree that free trade was a good thing. So we had to counter this notion that all economists believe this. And a relatively small group of economists and political scientists on the left organized to confront this mainstream think. Duncan Cameron in Ottawa was actually coordinated this as the as chair of the Pro-Canada Network Research Committee, but there was also all kinds of research that was being done throughout the country. And what happened there was basically that we taught each other. We did not know what was in the agreement. We did not know what the effects would be. And the participation of progressive economists is probably one of the finest hours for showing how something very complex could be worked on collectively by men and women all across the country. And of course, we couldn't know what the impact would be everywhere, but groups did know. Like once we could tell farmers, for example, what was likely to be in it, or once we knew what was likely to happen in the service sectors, the nurses could understand what was going to happen. So there was a contribution in the research from the various groups all over the country. So ultimately, we did have a very sophisticated analysis developed at both the academic and the more popular levels, material that was widely distributed. And I think what was most significant was that once people understood the implications, the political action accelerated. And mostly this was independent of the central groups and academics. People organized their own wherever they are. And ultimately, the biggest collective understanding of the free trade agreement was that it would move Canada toward the type of system the corporations and the US wanted, that harmonizing the economy would mean harmonizing the social life of people too. There's a lot to say about the politics of working together in a very large coalition like this. It was a relatively new way to work, and nothing had been undertaken in the country that was that busy. And to say that it was difficult and often fraught is a vast understatement. And I have a lot to say about it in the article, but I don't have time to talk about it. But just to say that the trade unions and the central bodies like the Canadian Labour Congress were used to, because they usually had to pay for things, they were the richest of all the groups, they usually got to call the shots, and this wasn't going to be the way this could work, and it didn't. And I must say there were a lot of progressive people in the trade unions who realized this, and it fairly rapidly became a much more movement where people were recognizing the different kinds of strength that different players had. Ultimately, we built friendships and we relied on the dynamic aspects of these friendships over that period, and which continued long afterward as well. Now, the 1988 election was a failure, and it was unique in some way in that it was about a single issue, something that had not occurred in anyone's living memory. The sides on free trade were clearly drawn, and going into the election, the polls showed that the majority of people opposed free trade. Although, as we know, electoral politics do not usually reflect majority opinions, as occurred in this particular case. It was particularly noteworthy that there was a very large gender gap. By October 1988, 47% of the males were against free trade, but 66% of the females were against free trade. The failure is because we ultimately had to rely on political parties and their own agenda. Most significantly was the serious miscalculations of the NDP and its suspicion of coalitions and its unwillingness to work with them. And this was too bad, because most groups against free trade were naturally allied with the NDP. And I must say one exception there was Stephen Langdon. He was the NDP trade critic, and he was very good on the issue. I suspect that because so much of this was centered in Ottawa for the NDP, the Council of Canadians had originally been associated with the Liberal Party and had a more nationalistic rhetoric. But other groups were ones the NDP knew, and they knew well, so it was not a good move on the part of the NDP. The Liberal Party tended to be divided too, although John Turner was decidedly against free trade. And actually, he was unique in all of the leaders because he'd actually read the agreement and understood it. But the party itself was very divided, which we didn't quite understand at that time. In Quebec, some sectors were resolutely against free trade, but the government was in favor of it. In any case, Quebec was not the reason the election was lost, it was Ontario. The 1% difference in vote in Ontario would have changed the outcome of that election. Bob Rae was then, he's now a Liberal, but he was then the NDP leader in Ontario, treated any discussion of free trade as boosting the Ontario Liberals. So he stayed clear of the whole issue as well. That was a typical kind of NDP action at that time. Peterson, the Ontario Premier, was resolutely against free trade, but was silent during the weeks up to and during the election, and he even left the country for the last 2 weeks. And we only learned much later that this was probably because of the divisions within the Liberal Party. So free trade agreements are considered to expand. There's even during this dreadful time when we see what all the disaster of globalization is bringing forward, including the tremendous difficulties and incompatibility of vast globalization with climate change initiatives. We are still seeing that market creating and market expansion function occurring. There were some very good work against it that continued in Canada. There was the NAFTA, which some people are going to discuss later. There was a multilateral agreement on investment, which because of Canadian knowledge, what we really prevented from happening. That was really quite wonderful on the part of Tony Clark and Scott Sinclair. And then we still had the CCPA monitoring all the new agreements and what was going down. So, but there is no expansion of the or slowing down of that. Basically, there is no international market control of international trade. It is still left to nations to do this, but the corporations are more easily escape regulations because nations are less able to regulate because of the free trade agreements. So the international institutions are not up for market controlling tasks, and they haven't been and they aren't, and that whole aspect is even getting worse. And the other thing is that governments still do not involve general population and economic directions. It's all top down. Parties come up with their plans, the political parties also, by a select few and implement them with office when they go in office with no debate or discussion. And we're seeing this happen. So, you know, how to combat free trade is a discussion for another issue. I don't see that happening. Basically, there are critiques of what is happening internationally, but there is not a large movement any longer. The one in Canada lasted quite some time. It was most active during the Canada-US trade agreement. It continued to be active during NAFTA, although not quite as ramped up, and has been a critic, but not actually active since then. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marjorie. And Sandra Rain, the editor of the Journal of Socialist Studies, tells me that Marjorie's article will be up today, so I encourage you all to check it out. It provides a very rich and textured analysis of the free trade movement in the early days. Our next speaker is Paul Kellogg. Paul, do you want to take it away?
Sure. First, thanks to Benjamin and Chris for getting us all together, and thanks to Socialist Studies, Radhika, and everyone else and Sandra for doing the work on the journal. It's great to have this discussion, and it's a discussion that we need to have. I mean, I was thinking, I really like the phrase that Marjorie used, corporate bill of rights, to describe the trade agreements, and I made a list to myself. There's many others. I didn't put the MIA in there, but if you had CUFTA and then NAFTA, and then the World Trade Organization discussions that peaked around, that exploded at Seattle in 1999, and then the attempt to organize the free trade area of the Americas, which exploded into the big protests in Quebec City in 2001. Those were all in different ways about a really good summary of what's at stake in all of those is a corporate bill of rights. I remember the Quebec City one. My active participation would be in the latter end of those, around the anti-WTO protests in Seattle, in the Quebec City movement against the FTAA, etc. I remember in Quebec City in 2001, I remember Marjorie Cohen welcoming us all in 4 languages. She said, "Welcome to the revolution." It was amazing. It was kind of sent chills up your spine at that protest. I think that they're all linked. I think that there's a thread that runs through them. If my own personal active involvement was at the latter end of that list, in terms of getting a political orientation, the first movement around CUFTA, or the anti-CUFTA movement, was extremely important. The section of the left that I radicalized in was a left that emerged deeply suspicious of Canada and the Canadian state. In English Canada, in Toronto mostly, although Cornwall, but that doesn't matter, in Toronto, very interested in the Quebec movement for self-determination, very interested in I grew up in Cornwall, and in Cornwall is Akwesasne. Akwesasne poses the issue of Indigenous sovereignty every day, because it's the largest, I think it still is the largest reservation in all of Canada. And anyway, and our distrust of the Canadian state and our deep disaffection from things Canadian shaped the left I was in. And from that standpoint, there were a lot of debates about how you conceptualize Canada. The big frame that it was put in was the idea that came out of the big movement around the waffle was seeing Canada as a dependency in a political economy sense. And that was the theoretical space in which we argued. How do we understand this thing that is the Canadian state? One of the key theorists that we read in the 1980s was the next speaker, William Carroll, who wrote very, very interesting critiques of understandings of Canadian capitalism and critiques of the theories of Canada as a dependency. And our conclusion was that no, Canada is not a dependency. To see it as, you can only see it as a dependency of the United States if the frame that you have for the world system is small, a Canada-US frame. Once the frame includes the Caribbean, once it includes Mexico, once it includes the global South, once it includes internally Quebec and First Nations, Canada can't be seen as a dependency. It's a first world G8, G7 power, et cetera. It's an imperialist power in its own right. And from that standpoint, when the debates around CUFTA first emerged, one aspect of that became dominant in the thinking was, well, this is an argument for free trade. Something like free trade already exists between Canada and the United States. In fact, it did one of the most open borders in terms of trade back and forth. From that standpoint, it wasn't seen as that big a deal. Okay, the turning point that turned it in a different direction was a conference. I can't remember exactly which year it was, 87, 86, I can't remember. It was in that moment between 84 and 88. And I spoke on, and I gave the analysis of Canada not as a dependency. And the next speaker was a fellow who, I don't know what's happened to him since, but he was a shop steward at the old van plant in General Motors Scarborough, member of the CAW. I think it had just become the CAW from the UAW. I can't remember the exact dates, and he listened, he said, look, that analysis is right. Canada is an imperialist power, got it. But this thing that Mulroney's talking about really is pitched at a different level. It's not at the level of, it can't be addressed solely at the level of an understanding of the political economy of the Canadian state. It's a part of the employer's offensive. It's a frame within which to try to attack trade union rights. It's a frame within which to try to attack wages. It's a frame within to try to attack social service. It's a frame within which to try to dismantle Medicare, etc. We oppose it. We have to oppose it because of its, as the employer's offensive. The penny dropped. I remember that meeting absolutely. And I said, right. So we operate on two tracks. On the one hand, in order to build solidarity with Quebec and First Nations, in order to understand Canada's imperialist plunder of places like Jamaica and Mexico and elsewhere, we have a critique of Canadian imperialism. But in terms of the class struggle in Canada, understand what Mulroney and Reagan are about. They're about pushing the employer's offensive to roll back the gains of the 60s, roll back the gains of the 70s. And it was on that basis that tried to navigate things in the coming years. With that as a frame, it became clear that there were not all of the movement saw the movement as a movement against a corporate Bill of Rights. It was often seen much more as a Canadian national movement. There's a tension between those two things. And in January 1st, 1988, when the deal was signed, 2,000 people marched on the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. It was confronted by the cops. In solidarity, the group hung together and they sang a song. They sang "O Canada." Now, that would not happen at a social movement demonstration in 2021. A social movement demonstration in 2021 attacked by the police would not sing "O Canada." It gives you a sense of the dynamics in some sections of the movement. I want to look again at the 1988 election that Marjorie referenced, and I agree with her. Quebec was not to blame for that defeat. That's absolutely right. But at the time, many people did. I mean, it might have been a single issue election in English Canada, but in Quebec, there were two issues. There was free trade, but there was also the beau risque that had been shaped by the Parti Québécois and others that were talking about. I won't go into it, but it was part of the big debate about the national question in Quebec. And it had a very different flavor there. And in English Canada, there were some really, really nasty articles written in left publications saying Quebec is to blame. If it was not for Quebec, we would have stopped free trade. And I disagree. I think this test, as Marjorie says, the statistics don't bear that out. B, we cannot build a movement that's progressive in Canada in English Canada, if we do not have a sensitivity to the national questions that exist in Canada. At the very least, Quebec and First Nations have national questions that we have to take seriously. So the conclusion that I came to from all that was the anti-CUFTA movement, the anti-NAFTA movement. It was a significant these were significant parts of the fight back against the employer's offensive, but aspects of the theory and political economy which were carried with it ultimately made it harder to fight back. Now, why does this matter? This could be just an esoteric debate. You know, we could all have this debate and talk about what happened in '88 and what happened it became clear that it was important in 2015. 2015, that's when it became important, because anti-NAFTA politics returned in North America for the first time. Suddenly we're talking about NAFTA again in 2015, but we were talking about them because of Donald Trump. It was Donald Trump who launched an attack upon NAFTA and his absolutely racist Make America Great movement. And his attack on free trade was racist. It was, there was a trade war with China, an anti-Chinese trade policy. The attack on NAFTA, this completely mirrored his anti-Mexican rhetoric, anti-Muslim immigration policy. And there's a parallel story, I would argue, although I don't want to raise too many issues at once, in terms of Brexit, where the whole Brexit argument emerges with the right wing in Britain galvanizing around a Make England Great Again, or whatever you want to call it. And the problem was, and this is why I started getting interested in this, and I was very happy that Chris and Benjamin asked this, because the response of the left in Canada was very muted. 2015, Donald Trump is carrying this absolutely racist attack on NAFTA, and there was I don't remember big meetings taking on Trump's racism in Toronto or Edmonton or wherever. And that's at best. At worst, there was some welcoming of Trump's position. Jerry Diaz of the CAW, Dennis Williams of the United Auto Workers, the now scandal-ridden Dennis Williams, Thomas Walcom, very progressive journalist in the Toronto Star. If, you know, this could be good for us. Donald Trump's renegotiation of NAFTA could be good for us. This is a problem. There is zero way that an anti-trade politics that sides along with Donald Trump's attack on NAFTA can be anything progressive. And it shouldn't have been too difficult to see that the manner in which Trump attacked NAFTA amounted to barely coded anti-Mexican racism, completely consistent with his white nationalist US first policy. And that, I think, means that it merits revisiting the political economy underpinnings of the anti-free trade movements that we've had over the years. My article tries to summarize some of them, and I try to summarize them elsewhere, a little bit in Escape from the Staple Trap, and there's other pieces coming out. I just draw attention to two things to let us think about this. As Canada navigates the world, how is Canada navigating the world? It navigates the world at the peak of the world system. This is extremely important. And trade policies and the corporate bill of rights that happens are corporate bill of rights that work to the benefit of Canadian capitalism. They don't work to its detriment and undermining. And that value, the second point, and I won't put up the graphs to show it, but that value flows not from out of Canada because of these trade deals. Value is flowing into Canada from south to north. One of the worst moments I had in the anti-NAFTA campaign. I remember anti-NAFTA was going on, and there were lots of things going on with maps of Canada, US, and Mexico on T-shirts and on buttons. And that's fine, you know, maps of Canada, US, and Mexico. But one that was awful, and it was quite widespread. I can't find an image of it. I remember it in my head. I wish I could find an image of it. Was Canada, US, Mexico, with an arrow going down like this, and it said jobs going down to Mexico. And the argument was very straightforward. NAFTA means an attack on jobs in Canada and the United States. Where do those jobs go? They go to Mexico. Number one, this is wrong in terms of political economy. Number two, it opens the door to racism. The anti-NAFTA movement in its key organizational forms did not go down that road. The anti-NAFTA movement built real solidarity. There's a book that I quoted from a really interesting book. I can't remember where it is here. Oh, it's called Unions and Free Trade, Solidarity versus Competition by came out in 1992. Really interesting book that talks about the anti-free trade movement from the standpoint of building solidarity between Mexico, United States, and Canada. Excellent. That's within the frame of solidarity, we can actually develop a movement against the corporate bills of rights that keep coming up and keep piling up in our lives. But with an unclear political economy that situates Canada incorrectly in the world system as in some way as poor little Canada in some way, we can't do it. It is an analysis that doesn't work intellectually and theoretically. It can be shown to be wrong. It's an analysis that leads to either politics that don't work or silence when we are confronted with things that we can't incorporate into an old framework. I'm actually extremely optimistic because these debates are being reshaped by forces on the ground everywhere as we speak. In terms of trade, I think the one, I haven't talked about it this much, but the free trade area of the Americas, and this is where I'll end, the free trade area of the Americas movement, that was supposed to be the culmination of the three, first CUFTA, then NAFTA, then the free trade area of the Americas, then we'll have the Americas under the umbrella of neoliberalism and et cetera and all the rest of it. And it stopped. It's very important that it failed. It failed because of the social movements, but not the social movements in Canada and the United States. It failed because of the social movements in Bolivia and Venezuela. It is fundamentally important. It was it's 2004, 2005 when the Chavez and Morales accelerated the push for ALBA, for the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, precisely because 2005, January 1st, was supposed to be when FTAA came in, and they stopped it. It's very interesting that hasn't come in. There's all sorts of problems still, et cetera. And that movement in Latin America, which has been under such pressure in the last 10, 12 years, it's kind of come back. Bolivia has been able to overturn a right-wing coup d'etat and bring the mass back into office in a way that surprised me. It means that there is a ferment going on there that is very important for them. It's very important for us. So that's where I'll end it. I think that when we approach these corporate bills of rights from the standpoint of how do we build solidarity across borders, from the global north to the global south, then we can make some progress. And that has political economy implications and theory implications that we need to pursue. When we make our frame too narrow, and if it's just Canada, the United States, we're lost. We can't figure it out. I better stop now because otherwise Chris will turn off my microphone.
Thanks, Paul. And our next speaker is Bill Carroll. Bill, do you want to take it away?
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. And thanks for organizing this, Ben and Chris. And I've really enjoyed the first two papers, really just excellent presentations. So let me try to build on that as best I can. And I'm going to basically try to answer the questions that the editors of this special issue, which is now on our website, Radhika Desai has put the link, I think, in the chat. The editors posed some really good questions. So the first one was, how did you become involved in struggles around free trade in the 1980s? And for me, my involvement was really based in anti-capitalist activism going back into the 70s. And then beginning in 1983 here in BC with the social credit so-called restraint program, was really the vanguard of neoliberalism in Canada. And so I was quite active in organizing around that. And really that established a focus for me on neoliberalism and neoliberalism as a kind of hegemonic project, in which free trade is part of it, investor rights and the whole kind of WTO thing that we've been talking about. And I've been interested in this project of neoliberalism in BC, nationally, and indeed transnationally. So my initial take on free trade was that it was a pivotal strategy in the shift from the kind of Fordist Keynesian welfare state class compromise that we knew in the 50s and 60s and so on, to continental neoliberalism. And what I wrote in 1990, I said, the strategic unity of continentalism and neoliberalism lies in the mechanism that the emerging common market provides for shifting the balance of class forces in Canada to the advantage of capital. As capital circuits become fully continental, investment will flow to the cheapest and most compliant sections of the North American workforce. The organizationally decimated American working class will set the standards in Canada. So strategically, I think that was in the background of this project. And for Canadian capitalists, free trade with the US was also an important kind of defensive move. It was about securing undisturbed access to the US market in view of Reagan's renewed nationalism. After all, Ronald Reagan's electoral slogan was, "Let's make America great again," which should be familiar to people from 2016 as well. So the next question that the editors, or actually is the question that I inserted myself, how was free trade framed in Canadian politics? And we've been talking about a bit about this already. But one political scientist by the name of Inwood made the distinction between neoconservative continentalism, which was the pro side, versus nationalist social democracy, which was the predominant anti-side, with the latter emphasizing an interventionist role for the state up to and including industrial policy and a sharp critique of foreign control. So those are the two, pro-anti sides predominantly. There was obviously a lot more going on. But the point I make in the article is that, and it's similar to a point that Paul has already made, is that the left nationalist defense of the Keynesian welfare state was central to the Council of Canadians, the pro-Canada network, and to the kind of anti-free trade movement, at least the predominant kind of discourse, if you like. And this was an example of defensive mobilization from below, which affirms existing identities and practices. Now, Nancy Fraser, who's a feminist political theorist, has argued that such affirmative politics can gain political traction easily because it sort of confirms what we already think of ourselves, as in we're good Canadians, we have a good welfare state, we want to protect it. But the inattention to generative mechanisms compromises the real potential of affirmative politics to be transformative. And I think the implications for the struggle against free trade were that the affirmative frame gained traction in the critique of American domination, American imperialism in Canada, but it failed to educate workers and activists about neoliberal globalization and capitalist domination. It failed to name what we were actually struggling against. And in placing national sovereignty at the center of the narrative, it veiled the class relations, which I think were really the generative mechanisms that actually drove free trade. And thereby, it failed to activate or articulate the need for an alternative to capitalist class power. And I think the free trade agreement that resulted served as Marjorie has pointed out, it served as the template for all the other investor rights agreements, right, that come in its wake, confirming that US-Canada free trade was simply one major step in a hegemonic project of transnational neoliberalism, requiring internationalist and class-based response from the left. Now, the next question that the editors posed for us was, to what extent were these struggles successful? And I would say that the struggles in Canada against free trade were, in an immediate sense, unsuccessful, as both Canada-US free trade and NAFTA were enacted according to plan. And a measure of that consolidation is in Canada that by 2019, 3 decades on, there was no really visible organized opposition to Canada's continued participation in North American free trade and in some sort of NAFTA that eventually got renegotiated, as we know. And then the next question was that was posed was what's the legacy of the struggle against free trade today? And what lessons can be learned? Obviously, this is a really big question. And I'm just going to telegraph a few points about it. So the first one is that I think the years following NAFTA's enactment saw political struggles by the neoliberal globalizers to advance their agenda, as we know, and by popular movements to oppose that advance. And in the crucible of struggle, the opposition's self-understandings shifted to some extent from affirmed, settled identities, affirming those identities, to something more interesting for socialists. In a process of social movement learning that is intrinsic to activism, you know, people who are active in trying to change the world, it's a learning process. We learn as we bump up against structures of power and domination. We have to figure out ways around them or ways to deconstruct those structures. So in that social movement learning process that I think Marjorie has really pointed to as well, opposition to neoliberal globalization became framed not simply as a defense of national sovereignty, but as a proactive pursuit of global justice and democratization, which is, I think, where we need to be moving. For example, the Council of Canadians followed this path to some extent. So if you look at their discourse, it shifts from a discourse of national sovereignty in the 1980s to what's called popular sovereignty, which is not quite the same thing. It has to do with people making democratic decisions about, you know, concerns about their lives and having that capacity to make those decisions. By 1999, as we know, many Council of Canadian activists were shoulder to shoulder with US-based activists at the battle in Seattle against the WTO ministerial. So there's a lot of learning that went on in the wake of this defeat And the next question was, to what extent is the struggle against free trade still a problem, and how has it changed? So I want to say a little bit more about that, actually. So first of all, we still need to view free trade as part of a larger hegemonic project, and free trade agreements as frameworks for shifting class power and enlarging investor rights in various ways, extending to intellectual property rights and financial services, right? I think the key priorities for the left here are obviously critiquing that project and forwarding a coherent alternative that moves beyond defensive affirmative politics. So what has changed? Well, and here we get, the agenda gets a little bit bigger, if you like, beyond free trade, perhaps narrowly defined, because after all, one of the key things that's changed is the period since the free trade agreements has been a period of cascading crises, right? The 2008 financial meltdown, visibly deepening climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic that we're living through now. All of these have provided opportunities for the left to counterpose alternatives to neoliberal globalization. And indeed, in the same era, post-free trade, if you like, or the era of free trade, whatever it is, there's been a widening and deepening of the movements of opposition, decolonial movements, indigenous movements, anti-racist movements, climate justice politics. But in Canada, responses from the social democratic left have been, in my view, underwhelming. The response to the 2008 meltdown, you remember, was to support a temporary Keynesian crisis management strategy led by Stephen Harper without really raising challenges to capitalism and class. These could have been raised in that context of a deep economic crisis. And by 2013, under Jack Layton's leadership, the NDP removed any reference to socialism from its constitution. In 2015, the NDP buried the LEAP manifesto rather than embracing it. NDP provincial governments have been pretty pathetic on the climate file. I can say that from British Columbia. There is no real sign, I think, of a shift to the left within the NDP. I might be wrong in that. We can discuss it. It's a really important issue, I think. A socialist ran recently for Green leadership. Dimitri Laskeros was narrowly defeated by the candidate of the party establishment. And I think the only bright spot in this regard, in terms of party politics, is indeed Quebec Solidaire. So what else has changed? Well, I think certainly free trade is one of several interrelated developments that have shaped the current crisis-ridden conjuncture. And that conjuncture, if you like, the complex cumulative impact of transnational neoliberalism now includes its normalization as established policy and common sense. It's always the default policy now, right? Pro-market policies, privatization, deregulation, light regulation. This is the way people now tend to think. But at the same time, since 2008, financial meltdown and the whole crisis of neoliberalism, there's a partial unraveling of neoliberalism. So it's been normalized, it's also unraveled a bit. And since the in the wake of that, of course, there's been the ensuing far-right nationalist reaction to various things, including the immiseration that follows from transnational neoliberalism for many people, particularly the lower strata of the working class. Now, alongside other political ecological elements, I think the deepening climate crisis, the growing critique of extractivism, and the resurgence of indigenous politics, we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic needs to be taken into account. And this public health emergency has exposed fundamental problems in neoliberal globalization. Indeed, less than 3 decades after neoliberal champion Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, Alfredo Saad-Fihel has, in view of the pandemic, declared the end of neoliberalism. That might be a bit of a premature judgment, but we'll see. Now, I think the next question, maybe this was the last question, I think it was perhaps that the editors posed, which was, how do you think people on the left can effectively confront the project of free trade today, while at the same time challenging both far-right nationalism and neoliberal globalization? And the way I would address this is to first point out that the challenge for the left today, as I see it at least, is to reposition national popular tropes, disengaging them, disentangling them from the hegemonic discourses of the capitalist state, setting them within an alternative whose trajectory is toward internationalism, the common interest we share in creating a world in which human thriving and ecological health are regnant values. Meanwhile, politicians like Justin Trudeau, of course, and I think we could probably add Joe Biden here too, although he's being pushed toward a kind of somewhat of a more Green New Deal agenda in some ways by a reinvigorated left within the Democratic Party in the United States. But in any case, politicians of that sort, Trudeau, Biden, have assumed the mantle of ethical political leadership in progressive cosmopolitan neoliberalism today. And this appears to be the main alternative to far-right nationalism. I think the left needs to present an alternative that rejects both of these hegemonic projects and that points toward green democratic socialism, both locally and globally. So as final thoughts, I think we can sort of see that one of the alternatives that resonates with some of what I've been saying is Walden Bellow's notion of deglobalization, which he refers to as re-embedding the economy in society instead of having society driven by the economy, right? So taking back the economy, putting it under democratic control. And yet, deglobalization, very importantly, does not mean a return to closed border parochialism, right? It's a deglobalization of capital that we're talking about here. It's stopping that logic of endless growth on a global scale. The climate crisis and the pandemic alert us to the necessity of planning and coordination on a global scale to match the scale of the crisis. So parochialism and nationalism in that sense is quite problematic, obviously, in a period when we need to be actually globalizing in some respects, but not in the way that capital globalizes. But the response to the crises we face will need to be globally coordinated and planned. The collective agency for transmission or transition to democratic eco-socialism is, I think, emerging, although in Canada, the political current is relatively weak. Still, the LEAP Manifesto and the LEAP, those kinds of forces, Quebec Solidaire, there are some significant initiatives that are underway. So the conclusion that I come to in the article is that the urgent existential crisis posed by climate breakdown can catalyze radical thinking and acting, but only if the left is able to connect the dots between climate and capitalism in a way that insists upon an exit from extractivism and colonialism. Given capitalism's global reach, these transformations must reach beyond national borders, which requires building a green left with transnational scope. Yet a global green left must find its footing in local and national politics, constructing pathways in consciousness and action that lead beyond affirmations of national identity. In all this, the struggle against both transnational neoliberalism and far-right nationalism occupies center stage. That's it.
Great, thanks, Bill. And for our final speaker, we have Claude Vaillancourt. Claude, do you want to take it away?
Hello. First, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this important reflection on the struggles against free trade. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, but Attac will publish next month, I mean, a book called 20 ans d'altermondialisme au Québec, 20 years of globalism in Quebec. And that's about the same idea, to think about our action, our struggles, about where we are, what have we done. So it's a kind of, it's interesting to make a link between the two. Of course, today we're talking not only 20 years, we're talking about something like 30 years, 35 years. And I've great admiration for the one that are there from the beginning of this important struggle. My own engagement is more recent, and it was not obvious for me as an intellectual to familiarize myself with such an issue. When Canada signed the first free trade agreement with the United States, I was not that interested, I must confess. And I must say that at this time, most of the French-speaking intellectuals were independentists, and many of them, I think they made a big mistake. This mistake was that they thought that signing free trade agreement with the United States could free ourselves from economic blackmail from Canada. So if we can do trade with Canadian, if we were independent, so we could turn to United States market, we can do trade with American. Finally, it was something, this was a very wrong analysis, but it was important by this time. When WTO was founded, I was not very interested either, but I must say that I wasn't the only one at this time. Things began to change with the multilateral agreement on investment. As a writer, as an artist, this time I was touched personally. There was an important cultural angle with this agreement that could stop public financement of art and harm our cultural policies. It was strongly against my vision of diversity in art and culture. I thought that this time I should do something. Then there was the WTO Seattle Summit, which interested me quite a lot. And then there was the Quebec Summit of America in 2001. I was there, and all the social movement was there, social movement in Quebec and even in Canada. And what I saw literally struck me during a weekend. It was like a medieval siege, but with the head of state, people democratically elected inside the walls. They needed to be protected for doing something that the people they were supposed to represent didn't want. And they sent the police against us. It was rough, it was violent. I didn't expect that in my country at this moment, but now I must say that I've seen a lot more in different other occasions. So I thought that from now, I couldn't go on being a spectator and I had to do something. Then I discovered Attac Québec that was newly founded. This association that existed in about 20 countries works in different issues like tax Tobin, tax havens, environment, fighting neoliberalism. But free trade is one of these main preoccupations. Finally, I get much more involved on this issue that I could thought initially. As an activist, of course. I gave many lectures. I wrote 2 books on this topic. I coordinated a 3rd one. I've been involved in many events related to free trade. I met politicians, media, usual work for an activist. And I was particularly involved in the fights against GATS, CETA, NAFTA, but also in free trade in general. So what do I have learned in all my years of activism? What can I think about it? Well, I could say that I still wonder if the glass is half full or half empty. We have the impression of having lost a lot. Canada have signed big number of free trade agreement, including the last one that are the biggest, and in this agreement are not in our side. They're not doing us well, and we have a lot to criticize against them. But we have to, we have stopped some of the worst agreement. I think about MIA, FTAA, GATS. CETA is still not ratified thanks to our European friends. And without our opposition, I think the actual situation would be a lot worse. Second, free trade is still an important issue, of course, but it's much more difficult to make people aware of that. I think there's a kind of resignation. We live with that. The big agreement are signed. So what can we do now? We just have to live with this, to learn to live with this. And I don't think it's a good thing. I think we're a little bit victim of a natural curb of the preoccupation. At the beginning, it's popular, it's important, but it's fading gradually. There's a passage to indignation. People say it's unacceptable. Let's do something about it. And there's a kind of a strong emotion, but it's changed to obligation to deal more and more with high levels of technicalities. Today, we speak about ISDS, regulatory corporation, TRIPS, and we have more and more agreements with difficult names, difficult to remember. So it's really difficult for most of the people to be attracted by that and for us to gain public attention. But I think there's a change now with COVID and global warming that shows very clearly problems due to trade. Is it enough? Is it going to be to change? Is it going to change the issues? I don't know. Also, we talked about that. I think it's something very important. That's the confusion created by the extreme right governments and political party. They're critical against the free trade, but of course, we don't want to be associated with them. Our critics are radically different, and it's quite obvious that something is not very easy to explain. So what are our challenge for the next year? I think regarding to free trade, it's regulatory cooperation. It's something we really have to face. It's discrete, it's complete, but it may be worse than ISDS because it gives the big company a big control on regulation, and this regularity corporation give them what they need. Another challenge for the next year is GAFAM and e-commerce. How to keep them under a certain control. I think that the free market give them a power that we couldn't expect. But the thing that maybe is positive, and we talked about this too, the other speakers, it's the COVID and the global warming. It exposed the need of a fundamental change in our type of economy. I think if we don't want that the COVID, and that's another pandemic comes back, if we want to really fight efficiency the global warming, we have to change our economy, and this other economy, there's no room for free trade as we know it. And it gives something very interesting. In Quebec, we have something that we call Quebec Zen. It's a grassroots project to make the ecological transition We have a roadmap very complete of hundreds of propositions, and now there are communities that will take this with them and they try to make change on their communities, and also political pressures on Canadian government and Quebec government. So it's something that is very positive. It's not translated in English now, the roadmap. If you're interested to this, maybe it would be something to follow. But the English tradition will be there very soon. So I think that what is going after will be very interesting, and well, I hope we will still be there. So excuse my English, it's not perfect, but I hope that I've been clear. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Colette. That was excellent, and it's nice to end on a more upbeat note in terms of the possibilities for change. Thanks to all of our speakers. That was a really great discussion. And now we have some time for questions, comments. So in terms of procedure, I ask you to either put your questions in the chat or raise your hands, and we'll create a speakers list for people that want to speak to these issues. And don't be shy. Does anybody want to kick things off? Or Megan, or is that Radhika?
Oh, well, I was collecting a few questions that I saw in the chat. So I am just going to ask those really quick. I had two questions for Marjorie that came up during all the talks. One is a relatively quick one from Elizabeth Lee, who's asking about, Marjorie, the statistics that you were talking about when you were looking at the gender breakdown of who opposes free trade. And she was wondering if that was BC only or if it was Canada wide. And then also for Marjorie, Laurel asked, why was the Assembly of First Nations at the first meeting of the Coalition Against Free Trade and later a member of the Pro-Canada Network and Action Canada Network? Among other things, they understood the dangers of the corporate agenda, the significance for the resource sector for deregulation, including environmental deregulation. So maybe that'll get us kicked off.
Marjorie, do you want to respond?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for those questions. Elizabeth Lee, the statistics were for Canada-wide. I don't know what these were a long time ago, and I don't know what they were individually and within the provinces. So that's what that was. It was Canada-wide. Women were, just overwhelmingly against free trade at that particular time. And I think we should just let Laurel answer her own question. I'm sure she can, but I do remember that First Nations people were extremely concerned because it was something that was really touched on their issues and exploitation of their land, and they knew that was just going to continue. I mean, that was just an incredibly important issue, and I probably didn't emphasize enough how much they were on it. At some point, I want to respond to the whole notion of nationalism and this being a overly nationalistic group, but I'll do that later. Laurel, can you say something there?
I don't have anything particular to add. I just think that it's really important to name the deregulation agenda that was that figured so large in the corporate agenda, and the work that was done on environmental deregulation by Michelle Swinerchuk and the CELA and other organizations at the time. And it's part of that education that you were talking about that was shared and built on.
Yes, I didn't talk about all the groups, and the environmental groups came a little bit later into it all, but boy, they were fantastic at that time. And Michelle Swinerchuk was the leader of that all initially, and she had been a labor lawyer, and then she became the head of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. And that was really an extraordinary addition to the whole anti-free trade campaign.
Okay, so we have a speakers list. Please let me know if you want to be added to it. We have Radhika and then Fernando. Radhika, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks everyone. I mean, Chris, Benjamin, all the 4 speakers, fantastic panel, really great. And you can see the enthusiasm here, and I'm really looking forward to as much of the discussion as I can hear, because I have to leave for another meeting. But I just wanted to say quickly that, first of all, Marjorie, thank you for the great presentation, because I think the way you put out the way in which different groups entered and became part of the movement is really important for us to think about how do we create a broader left, which includes a much more diverse set of groups today than we have ever had. So I think that's a very important thing. And that's, like, for me, this panel is important because it's not just about the past. It's about what do we learn from the past going forward. And then I was very struck that Paul and Claude and Bill all touched on some really key issues. So Paul, I felt really hit the nail on the head when he said that jobs going south was not really the point on which to oppose, because look at it this way, when jobs go south, they are going south so that jobs in the South may remain low wage, which means no development. So in that sense, I think workers in the North and South have a great deal to ally about. And I think this is how we need to look at it. We need to create an anti-imperialist alliance. I think this is the need of the hour, so to speak. So I think that workers in first world countries need to essentially see that the reason why jobs are going south is because the South, through imposition of neoliberalism, etc., is being kept undeveloped, which means the wages are low, etc. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then secondly, with both Bill and Claude emphasizing the elements that I guess I'm using more Bill's words, but they were there in Claude's presentation as well, the deglobalization mechanism element and so on. I just wanted to say that I think the important thing for the left going forward is actually to talk about how are we going to reorganize the productive economy, not just how we are going to redistribute what the productive economy produces, because the productive economy is actually not working very well already, and it's not going to improve if my analysis of the productive economy is any good. So I really feel, and that is something the left has tended to stay away from, because it implies being illiberal, breaking the liberal ideas, essentially imposing obligations on people, as well as giving rights to people. And I think that we need to crack that nut, because otherwise, and that's partly why we so easily dismiss the experiences of actually existing socialism and communism. Nobody is asking anybody to endorse them uncritically, but unless we engage with them seriously and understand exactly what went right and what went wrong, we're not going anywhere. The train for socialism is not going to leave the station, basically. So I just wanted to say that, and thanks again for a really great panel.
Great, thanks, Radhika. And maybe we could take a few more comments and then come back to the speakers. So Fernando, do you want to ask a question?
Fernando, you're muted.
Oh, I have 2 questions for Professor Kellogg. One of the things that I was surprised is that when talking about the new trade agreement signed between Canada and the United States and Mexico, he said that he was racist. And I was taken quite aback, because normally, as Radhika mentioned a moment ago, the reason why jobs go there is because they cheap labor. And I don't see what is the connection there with racism. The second question I have is that he mentioned Maduro and Morales, Bolivia and Venezuela, but he totally failed to mention Lula. I just would like to remind him that Lula was the one that began the whole process of a new vision about Latin America. He created the São Paulo conference, where it exists until today. And thanks God, probably Lula is going to be reelected. So I think that that's a very, very dangerous omission to mention Morales and Maduro, who are a product, in fact, of what Lula created in Latin America.
Great, thanks, Fernando. And maybe we'll take a question from Daniel. Daniel, do you want to say something?
No, I just would like to have a response.
Oh, sure. Well, we could go for a response if you want.
I do want a response. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, I know. I was just doing a round of comments, but maybe Paul.
It's not a comment. There are two questions.
Yeah, I know, but I'm getting to that. So, Paul, do you want to respond?
If that's okay, I'd love to. Fernando, thank you very much for your observations. What you're observing is what happens when I speak too fast and compress ideas. The main idea about Trump and NAFTA is that Trump's motivations were racist. The politics behind his desire to have a trade war with China and to attack NAFTA was part of his whole creation of the other as the problem to the things in the United States. We have to make America great again. What's the problem? The problem is Mexico. We have to make America great again. What's the problem? The problem is China, and all that type of politics. So the issue is the political motivation behind the new anti-trade campaign that came up under the Trump umbrella. And that did not become a theme of the way in which the left navigated this territory, at least in the left that I was navigating in 2015, 2016, 2017. It was by and large kind of passivity and silence in Canada around this. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I was in the wrong cities. In other cities there was something going on, but I think that there was a very deeply wrong analysis about what Trump represented that we can go into. And it also, anyway, in terms of your second point, Lula, thank you for bringing Lula into the picture. Once again, it's a question of compressing things into too small a frame. The longer story about the FTAA is that we have to see the anti-globalization movements as being global and international. And even if sometimes our movement in Canada goes quiet and is a little weak, elsewhere, it can be very big and very effective. And the defeat of the FTAA, in my opinion, not everyone agrees with this, but in my opinion, it was a huge thing that the FTA didn't come in. Number two, that it was primarily the result of the pink tide, which Lula was a very big part of. Lula, Venezuela under Chavez first, and et cetera, and the Morales. And we have to embrace those movements as part of our own movement. That's all I'll say. I really appreciate your intervention, and this exchange is very important in terms of trying to how we situate ourselves. I have some things to say on Radhika's point, but maybe I'll hold back and let the discussion go. And I haven't forgotten what you said, Radhika. I'll come back to it on another round.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, maybe we should take a few more comments and then come back to the speakers. So we have Daniel and then Daryl. So Daniel, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I guess my question is that I am myself actually coming from the Ontario public interest research world, like from Oprah Guell. And I've been aware of the free trade situation, obviously going back to '99. The staff member, I guess, of that chapter went to even Seattle back in that day and was heavily involved in the G20 organizing as well. But anyway, I guess really what my kind of question is or thinking is that I think of the elite manifestos you folks mentioned, and I'm thinking all the way back to the CCF, how you had the Regina Manifesto. And I'm thinking essentially a merging of those two manifestos and having a truly progressive, essentially socialist, democratic, full kind of like a way forward would make sense, because like I said, all these parties seems like every time they get into Ottawa, everybody or political scientists are like, oh, gotta go to the center, the vote's at the center. But really the socialist way forward, this collective way forward is the collaboration, consensus model is the way forward. So I guess what's your folks' take on the idea of like essentially merging something from the past, which is the CCF, with this, what do you call it, the Elite Manifesto? That's my question.
Great, thanks. And maybe I'll just do one more from Daryl, and then we'll do a go around of the speakers, if that makes sense. Daryl, do you want to ask your question? I think you're muted.
There, okay. This brings back a lot of memories. It was an important part of the people's history of Canada. For several years after the 88 election, I represented the Canadian Peace Alliance at the Pro-Canada Network and the ACN. So it was very interesting to hear the different perspectives and memories of different people here. I think it's important to remember, as well as part of this discussion, this memory, that the Canadian Labour Congress very prominently participated in these movements. I remember that they targeted 50 Conservative members of Parliament for defeat in the 1988 election. So they were very political, not just in an economic sense, but a political sense. Bob White, of course, wrote a letter of criticism about the NDP's campaign after the 1988. He was very disappointed in that. So that dynamic was very important, I thought, as well. And then I think 4 years later, Bob White and CAW and a whole bunch of other unions came together to gather 100,000 people on Parliament Hill. So the defeat of the Tory government was delayed for 4 years, I think, as a result of all the shenanigans that have been mentioned in this conversation today. Now let's see. In the peace movement, I thought we had much more of interest in understanding why the US was interested in free trade with Canada. And we always thought it was something to do with Fortress North America in its rivalry with the Soviet Union militarily, and also with Japan and Europe economically. So they needed all the resources they could get. They were looking for concessions from Mexico and Canada. And that's really what ended up happening in a large degree. So there were winners and losers. There was a concentration and centralization of capital on both sides of the border. Workers lost as a result of that. And I always want to remember in these conversations about free trade, the early classical economists, what they said about free trade, that at that time, 150 years ago, it was a matter of protectionism versus free trade. The development of national markets to the point where countries no longer could contain their economies within their own borders. Therefore, free trade was the answer. But in imperialism, in our present epoch, it always has been one of not just free trade, but rivalry is the opposite. Rivalry represented through tariff wars and increasing rivalry leading up to military conflict. So we have, we see free trade as coming under a serious attack by elements of the most reactionary and pro-war elements of the capitalist class today. I think bears comment at this time. That's really what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Daryl. And we've done a round of comments. I'm wondering if any of our speakers want to kick in their thoughts at this point. Does anybody want to speak to any of the issues that have been raised?
I'll speak to these issues. I forgot how you chat, let you know. Hello?
Hello? You want to chat?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to those issues.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, there was Radhika's comments, right? That were regarding the importance of building internationalism in this context, with the focus on the global South. Fernando brought in the issues in Latin America, as well as talking about Trump and the politics around that. We had Daniel, who was asking about a new kind of Regina manifesto and the possibilities of organizing around that. And then Daryl's comments have put this all in historical perspective in terms of looking at the relationship between free trade and I guess geopolitical rivalry, if I'm not mistaken. So do you want to speak to any of those issues?
Yes, I wanted to thank Daryl for reminding us of all the work the CLC did. It was a fantastic amount of work during that whole period of time. And also the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, both of them continued with dealing with the issue, and the CCPA actually hired Scott Sinclair to be the trade crit, and he's kept on top of everything. That made a huge difference. One of the reasons why the MAI was defeated and things like that. So that was incredibly important. I wanted to then go to what Radhika said. Basically she was interested in how do you energize broad groups, and particularly of young people. And it seemed to me one of the great first of all, I think one good slogan might be unmute yourself. We have to get people to start being interested in things and being outspoken about it. And that was one of the great things about the anti-free trade movement. It was one where there was very little direction from the center, so groups of people could do what they wanted to do. But I think there was one particularly important lesson, and that was a focus on issues and actions could bring people together in a way that sitting around and having discussions about different ideological approaches could not. That is where everything falls apart. When you start doing that and then have to figure out where you're going to go from your ideology and all get together on the right ideology, that doesn't work. Not when you want to get lots and lots and lots of people together. And that was the very, very important thing that happened with the anti-free trade movement. People were at different levels of understanding what the issues were, how you could change anything, or if you could change anything. So that was really important, to trust each other by being together. With regard to Fernando's issues around Latin America, what was so important in the anti-free trade movement was the way we connected with people in Mexico and it was very clear to us during the anti-free trade movement, there was going to be a NAFTA. We didn't know what it was going to be called, but it was very, very clear to us there was. And we were contacted by people in Mexico, trade unionists and others in Mexico, and intellectuals, economists, who really wanted to know what our experience was. And we have had a lifelong contact with these people, very, very close contact, and we've interacted completely with them. And that was a very, very important connection during the whole NAFTA debate. So these connections aren't quite what I'm not sure they are, but they aren't quite what they were during the anti-free trade campaign and the anti-NAFTA campaign. We never had quite the same connections during the anti-free trade campaign with the Americans. They were with some unions, like the Steelworkers for Sure, and some of the other unions that saw the dangers of this, but not. I tried hard with the feminist movement. They were not interested. They were slightly interested later with Mexico, but that's when they saw Mexico as more of a threat than treating it as an ally. That's what was going on there. I think that might have changed over time, but certainly we were looking for allies in this whole continental move that was occurring in the trade agreements. So I think there's a lot of room. The last one is Daniel's about a manifesto. I think they're always worth trying, you know, because sometimes you can get people to agree on things, but often they, people won't for one reason or another. I don't know. I haven't seen one for a long time that's had widespread use, but it might be a tactic that works. You never know. Just because it hasn't recently doesn't mean it can't in the future.
Great. Paul, do you want to chime in?
Love to. What a great way of putting it. Do you see Mexico as a threat or an ally? That's exactly the dichotomy that I was trying to get at. When Mexico was embraced as an ally, the movement could move forward. But when sections of the movement began to see sections of the global South as the other, and it happened in some of the most surprising places. I loved Seattle. I loved the big demonstration in 1999 that Claude referenced about in the World Trade Organization. But one aspect of it I didn't like. There was a march that some trade unionists were involved in down to the harbor where they symbolically dumped steel into the harbor that was supposed to be representing dumping made in China steel. And that's a problem. Once we make our movement see China as the problem or Mexico as the problem, then we're in trouble, because we're then speaking a narrow language of, call it what you will. We've put up walls around ourselves in such a way that we can't build. I'm going to make an appeal for theory here. I believe that I'm very optimistic. There is a ferment amongst young people. They do not want this system to continue the way it is. They are disgusted with the world that they've inherited, largely through the climate destruction, but there are other issues. We saw in the States in the summer of 2020, I think it is the biggest mass movement that the United States has ever seen, the Black Lives Matter movement. It was millions of people. So some of us from an earlier generation can help with discourse, I think, about theory. Like in terms of jobs, you can do the charts. If you have an atheoretical approach, it seems very easy. The jobs went south. But if you have theory, you say, actually, no, it's the organic composition of capital. It has to do with the rising organic composition of capital. It has to do with capitalist competition, etc. These sounds like very esoteric ideas. They're actually crucial to our activism. We can't have simple theory and complex practice. To have deep, meaningful practice, we have to have deep theory as well. I would highly recommend the work of a political economist from the Indian subcontinent, Ranjit Sao, who did really brilliant work 25 years ago showing the way in which our currency inequities make it inevitable that value flows from the global South to the global North, from India to Canada, from India to the United States, and that structure, as long as it's in place, means that the world is doomed to inequality. And we have to deeply engage with these ideas. I think if we have the energy of the summer of 2020 with a really firm commitment to theory and understanding precisely how this awful world is organized, I think we can make some real progress. So that's my pitch. And I'm not making it as a professor, I'm making it as an activist.
Thanks, Paul. Bill or Claude, I wonder if you want to make any comments?
Sure, yeah, if I can jump in. Thanks, Chris, and these are excellent questions, of course, and I like the responses that people have been giving. Marjorie taking up the whole question of, and Paul too. That there's a tremendous opportunity. I'm also, I guess I'm perhaps less optimistic than Paul, but I'm in moments. I have my moments of optimism, and certainly they are around the tremendous surge in movement activism on all sorts of different fronts and scales. And so I think, we need to build on that, obviously. And we need more transnational. It's difficult to do this work, as Marjorie was alluding to as well, in terms of developing continental solidarities. But I know during the free trade politics in the 80s and early 90s, a group called Common Frontiers, mainly labor-based, was building solidarities across the borders of US, Canada, and Mexico. And I think that kind of activism is really important in our current context. Radhika asked about the politics of deglobalization, alter globalization, restructuring the global productive economy. Obviously, these are gigantic questions that are not easily answered. But I guess my take on deglobalization is, again, not a retreat into hermetically sealed national economies, but definitely picking up on the ecological critique of capitalist globalization and how the ecological problems, the ecological footprint that global capitalism has bequeathed to us that really needs to shrink, and how is it going to shrink? That's an important question. So restructuring the productive economy is crucial, and obviously how to restructure the productive economy. Well, under capitalism, it's very difficult. The logic of capital is going to basically move toward larger corporations and more extractivism, not less, and so on and so forth. More resort to global transport, containerized shipping and all of these things that are actually, ecologically speaking, really problematic. So I agree with Paul, that we need to have theory. Theory is crucial in guiding practice. And if we think about the global capitalist system, there's a lot of evidence that that one of the key structural drivers of transnational neoliberalism has been the falling rate of profit on productive capital, right? And as that, and that has to do with the organic composition that Paul was referencing, the increased use of technology, replacing living labor, and reducing the actual basis for corporate profitability, ultimately, which is living labor. And so basically, that itself poses an enormous problem. Capital is trying to ratchet up the profit rate when the long-term tendency is for a falling rate of profit. And it does that through privatization, deregulation, accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey calls it. It does it in other ways as well. Transportation communication systems that are very efficient, but again, ecologically problematic. But the goal is obviously globalized accumulation to increase the rate of profit and resort to cheap labor. We know the narrative, right, by now. And it's only international solidarity of the working class and its allies, and there are many allies of the working class, and the working class is a very broad formation, right? It's more than just factory workers, it's most people in the world. And so I think there's reason for optimism, but there's a need to have a theoretical analysis of capitalist political economy that helps us to figure out what we need to be doing strategically, both locally and ultimately globally. I had one more point, I guess, just responding to Daryl very quickly, because that's a really interesting question about imperialism and rivalry. And of course, there is that aspect to, we can see it playing out in terms of the United States and China in particular. The United States, the declining hegemon, and China as the rising challenger. And there's a real rivalry there. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that the globalization of capital itself has really muted these inter-imperialist rivalries to some extent. And the kind of global governance regimes that we have now around neoliberalism, right, such as the WTO and the whole list of organizations, right, that underwrite global capitalism. All of that, these are expressions of inter-imperial cooperation. So there's a kind of mixed motive game going on here, if you like. There's the rivalry aspect, the geopolitical rivalry, which is real, but there's also the kind of class solidarity among capitalists, among state managers, trying to govern this system of global capitalism. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Bill. And Claude, I'm wondering if you have any comments?
Yes, I'll go on with Paul's optimism, because I think we really need this in this difficult time. What I've changed since the beginning, since I began to fight against free trade, is that we were talking about things that will happen, and now we're talking about the things that are happening. And maybe these things are even worse than we thought. Things are not very good. But I think that if we can make links between COVID, destruction of environment, underfinancement on public services, and global warming, if we can do this link as a society, I think we can change something very important and find arguments very strong against free trade, and maybe arrive to the big transformation that we really need.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more round of questions. We've been going for a while. So if you guys have a question, basically speak now or forever hold your peace. Just put up your hand. I've been taking a list. I just wanted to come back to a question from John Calvert. He asked if anyone in the panel wanted to talk about the role of the BCNI and big business in the 1988 election and the money they put into supporting Mulroney's election campaign. And then I have a question from Kim and Cheryl. Do you guys want to ask a question? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Are we ready? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. We're here in the home of the Kakite unceded territory of the Kakite First Nation in New Westminster, BC. This is a terrific discussion, and thanks to everyone. One thing we ought to remember is that capitalism changes constantly, as Bill was just saying, and opposition to free trade, no matter how important people thought it was at the time, was tactical, not strategic in the overall process of trying to build socialism. And one of the things that certainly free trade isn't essential to capital. Now the biggest threat we faced under Trump was American protectionism, and that was such a spanner in the works that it seemed to me that neither the Canadian left nor the Canadian labor movement had any response whatsoever to the fact that Trump was putting not opening up free markets, but putting tariffs on our products. How do you folks respond to that?
Okay, great question. Maybe we can take a couple more. We have Ernie Epps, who is next on the speakers list. Ernie, do you want to ask a question?
I wondered if I might say a little bit more than just a question. And I should say right off, I'm in my 80th year, but I had open heart surgery 3 years ago. And after 6 hours on the table in Toronto, I'm in my middle years now. So let me say that I'm working on a book at the moment toward the cooperative commonwealth, which might just echo with the Regina Manifesto and so on, although it can go even further back. And so I found myself immersed for a little while with the nightmare of North American racism and then the nightmare of American capitalism. And this afternoon, I was finishing up the Capitalist Project chapter, which gets us into the human horror of 1995 and later. And so if I go back, I was MP for Thunder Bay Nipigon in 1988, fighting the free trade election, of course, as a New Democrat. And among the thoughts, just a few thoughts that come to mind are of course, the contradiction. Here's a pulp mill town where we've been exporting newsprint for decades. And so we appreciate trade with a vengeance. But we know that the free trade agreement is so much more than a maintaining of open borders. And the open borders, of course, were challenged for the softwood lumber producers time after time, which was why that dispute settlement mechanism was so important. But the point made that this was the beginning of an array of such agreements is a very interesting one. Maybe the only other thing I'll say about the 88 election is that I remember Ed's once saying in caucus, and we hesitate to say these sorts of things, that if it came to a kind of a defense of or an attack, better an attack on the agreement of the sort that John Turner carried out, that Ed said he wasn't up for that. And I often wondered about that a bit, but the suggestion this evening that the social democratic response was not the nationalist response opens new vistas for me in thinking about that. Of course, if I think about 1988 and 94 with NAFTA, I think immediately, and that's of course where the next chapter begins, the horror of Paul Martin's budget 95 and all that followed on from that and how we can achieve a cooperative commonwealth now. And so it's liberal betrayals, of course, and it's a nature of being a partisan here in saying that, but whatever John Turner said, Jacques Chrétien did not say that, and so on and so forth, the horrors that have happened. Anyway, I'd be interested in comments on that, and I found this already. Zoom is a marvelous platform, isn't it? And thanks so very much for all the very, very illuminating comments that you've offered.
All right, so we have a lot there, and there's still 3 more comments. So I think it's probably makes sense to hear back from the speakers before we come to our final 3 comments. But I'm wondering, I see Marjorie's hand is up. So did you want to speak to some of those issues?
Just very quickly, I mean, they're all extremely interesting. With regard to the BCNI, that was a very important organization in favor of free trade in Canada during the coalition when we had the anti-free trade activism for the first free trade agreement, also around NAFTA. I mean, they were amazingly influential. And what it was a association of the heads of corporations in Canada, and they supported it all the way. I mean, and they just were everywhere all the time, and they had a lot of money, and they put that into the campaign at the end. And that was, when I say, you know, the reason we lost the money was we lost the election was because of the political parties, but it was because of the vast amounts of money that the BCNI and other organizations like that were able to put into the campaign at the end. It was a very important thing. And I was so glad that Ernie Ept raised the whole issue of Paul Martin's 95 budget, because that really was, that just kind of tore everything apart. I mean, we can't get national programs again. I mean, the reason is because we had that 95 budget where everything was devolved to the provinces, and now provinces fight to be able to control it. And it's but also the tremendous reduction in what was happening around social programs. And when we see that we now have Canada is below the average of OECD countries, and what we spend on all of our governments on social programs is really shocking. And it's even worse in the United States. I mean, that's hard to believe because we have but that is the case. I mean, we are really, really in bad shape. And one thing I want to say that I've been meaning to say all along is my co-chair from Toronto, John Foster, is here, and someone else who is absolutely crucial to the whole anti-free trade movement was Laurel Ritchie, who was with the Canadian Chemical and Textile Workers Union at that time, and later CAW, and NAC, but they were both very, very active in the anti-free trade campaign. And I know there are many others here too from different parts of the country, but they were in the area.
Great. Any other comments from the speakers? I wonder if anybody wants to respond to John Calvert's BCNI question. I wonder if Bill has a response to that.
Yeah. Well, I would just agree with Marjorie. She's exactly right that the BCNI was an extremely important group and continues under a different name now as the Canadian Council of Chief, what is it? The Business Council of Canada. It went through a succession of name changes, but it's basically the CEOs of all the major corporations of Canada, and they are extremely well organized, obviously well funded, and there's been research back into the 80s showing how effective they have been in really defining the neoliberal agenda in Canada, including free trade, and shadowing the federal cabinet, for example, with committees assigned to each of the cabinet portfolios, and developing policy that basically gets handed over to the sitting federal government. And well, I don't want to make it sound too instrumental and rubber stamped and everything, but they are a very powerful lobby group, perhaps the most powerful in the country, and certainly played a really important role in various ways, also through front organizations in trying to put out populist kinds of statements and brochures and things in the debates around free trade. I guess just to put that in perspective, what we're talking about here is the top tier of the capitalist class. This is the most well-organized pro-capitalist and capitalist organization in the country, and it was fully behind the free trade agreement and was one of the key agents really in getting the whole thing happening and getting it through the hoops.
Paul?
Thanks. Question first, Chris, are we going to have a chance at the end to sum up at the end?
Yeah.
Or is this our last chance?
Here's my agenda. I've got 3 more speakers, and then I was thinking we could do
okay. So I'll be very brief, and so that means I'm going to flag the issue on protectionism, which was asked, which was a really important question, but I'm not going to answer it now. I'm saving it for my sum up because I've got a lovely quote, so I'm going to just not answer that one now. Okay. There was a Ernie Epp, thank you for your presence and your contribution. The 1995 Martin budget is a key part of this story. It's an extra. You can't tell the story about the corporate agenda and the corporate Bill of Rights without that budget, because it was devastating in what it did at the time. It's kind of been forgotten in history now. I'm really glad you're bringing it back up, because that is so I just wanted to flag that and thank you for doing the work on that. It's very important. It's a very big part of it, and it's why. Anyway, there's all sorts of issues with the Liberal Party, but we could talk about that another time. There was a question in the chat that I wanted to address from Stuart True about the worker-focused and climate-focused trade agenda of the Biden-Harris administration. I think I won't say anything except to say I'm astonished at how much Biden is taking aspects of the Green New Deal and starting to at least give lip service to them. I don't know exactly what it means, but I suspect it means that there's a ferment in the states around these issues that's bigger than we know. If it's being felt inside the Democratic Party, it's a big ferment. That's the only thing I'll say on that. And the issue on protectionism, I'm going to hold back to the last round of comments.
Great. And Claude, do you want to comment?
No, it's okay. I'll wrap up at the end.
All right. Okay. So we have 3 final comments, and one was Stuart's. So I just wanted to return to that and give other people a chance to respond as well. But Stuart was asking about the worker-focused and climate-focused trade agenda by the Biden-Harris administration. Is it just a version of Trudeau-like inclusive trade rhetoric or something new? We also have Ben on the list. Ben, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I guess this is a question to the panelists. When we talk when the conversation has been about internationalizing the struggle against internationalizing capitalism, one thing that hasn't been discussed in the conversation is the rise of China and just kind of geopolitics more generally. And I'm just curious what the panelists have to say about how workers can form new networks of solidarity with other workers around the world in the context of a new rising superpower who identifies as communist, but is really transforming the global balance of power economically and militarily. So just a kind of general question. Thanks.
Great. And we have one final question from Daniel. Daniel, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, sure. I guess my question is like you said, some of your folks were saying about a theory is important for practice. And what I was thinking is somebody by the name like Barry Weisletter with the NDP Socialist Caucus. And it seems as though at the policy conventions of the NDP, it's as though they tend to get the broom closet, I guess, for their workshop or their, but basically, I guess really what my question is kind of taking what you folks talk about academically and rhetorically and stuff like that, about the idea of that linkage. Is there like that linkage between, or has there been a linkage between like the NDP Socialist Caucus and getting like young people engaged and interested? Because I know, like, for example, the NDP Socialist Caucus has supported on both occasions of the leadership convention of Nikki Ashton. But yeah, I guess really just my general question is, has there been or could there be a linkage between this organization, that caucus, and kind of this resurgence of a socialist democratic discourse, I guess, and also translating to actual policy and towards a just and sustainable future? That's my question.
Great, and I think it's a good question also to wrap up on. So why don't we have each of our speakers respond to the final comments, and also please just give your final thoughts on all of this, where we're going. So maybe we could start with Marjorie, because she began the conversation, and go through as we did in the beginning. So Marjorie, do you want to give any final thoughts? Comments?
Just to respond to the questions, I'll be very quick on that, but someone earlier had asked about why there wasn't much done about when Trump put tariffs on Canadian products or had prohibitions on their coming into the country. And then the other question associated with that was what's happening with the Biden administration. And I think what we can see is the big problem there is that the Americans have ingrained in them, if anybody else wins, they lose. And that wasn't supposed to be the idea around free trade, but that's the old-fashioned approach to trade, but that's where they stick with it. And I don't think that's going to change with Biden, because that's a political issue for so if any industry loses in the United States, they're going to get American support. And that's what the whole thought was, that you were going to have access to the American market. That's how it was sold by the Business Council on National Issues. We need more access. We need bigger markets. We would then be able to hire more people, et cetera, et cetera. So the American, I think we're going to see more of that with Biden. You're not going to see the return to this whole notion of what free trade really, in theory, means. I just want to close, and I've really enjoyed hearing all of this and hearing what everyone has to say, and talking about something that people haven't talked about in a long, long time, which was the free trade movement, the anti-free trade movement. I wanted to say one thing about nationalism, the nationalism of the anti-free trade movement. It was a kind of left nationalism, but I would say it was a weak nationalism, in the sense that it wasn't that kind of nationalism that was my country right or wrong. Most of the people who were involved in the anti-free trade movement, and most of the groups, had seen the state not as their ally. They were up against the state. They'd been fighting it all the time, and the state was their enemy. That was the big problem. But they saw that it could get worse. That is the whole issue, and it's very much like, I think, or I understand in Quebec. You know, there's a nationalism there, not necessarily because that's ideologically where people are, but because they're up against something big that they have to confront collectively. And so that is the sense that happened. So as I said, most were very serious critics of power in Canada, and they continued to be all along. And that was where it was coming from, not because they thought Canada was better or best or whatever. And if there was "Oh Canada" sung somewhere, there's obviously some people who felt differently, who felt Canada was the best country in the world. But I want to say, among people who were fighting free trade, that was really not what the issue was. So I don't think they had an illusion that the state was an ally in struggles. I think they knew that this was going to be a slog all along the way. And so that is the kind of nationalism was people working together. And it was because all you had was another state imposing something on this state. And so that's all you had. You had us together, the people within this country. So that's what the kind of nationalism that it was. It wasn't something something that I would usually be against too, which is that kind of Trumpism that you know, make America first kind of nationalism, which, by the way, is not going to go away with Biden with regard to trade issues. So that's my sum up.
Thanks, Marjorie. Paul, do you want to go next?
What an interesting and important discussion. It's just great to be part of this. Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you for the organizers. And leave it to the last two questions, one from Ben and one from Daniel. It'll only take me 9.5 hours to address them. It's easy, you know, one on geopolitics and one on strategy. But no, I'm very quickly on each. In terms of China, the rise of China, the only thing I'll say is that let's take it seriously. And it puts a big question mark over the old issue that we used to have about US hegemony. It's a multipolar world. It's not a single polar world. That's a very important step that not everyone's willing to take. And theoretically, I think it's very important. Number two, in terms of the NDP and the left, I don't, my answer to that is I don't know. But let's find a way to be in bigger rooms. We can be in bigger rooms with more people because my strong sense is that there is an audience for the kinds of Green New Deal ideas that Bill and others have been talking about. And if we end up speaking in a small room, it probably means we're in the wrong room, and go to a bigger room where there's more of an audience, because they're there. We just have to find them. And it's quite, I learned from my kids are into it in a big way. Okay. They're not really political, but they're agitated about the destruction of the world and they want an answer. And so anyway, that's okay. I promised to end on protectionism. So 1980s, it's free trade. 2021, it's Trump and protectionism. Okay. So the things shift. 100 years ago in 1921, it was protectionism. In the wake of World War I, there was a huge push towards trade wars at the end of the war. And J.B. McLaughlin, who some people might know, who was a trade union leader from the Maritimes, he was prohibited from working for his role in organizing strikes, so he launched a newspaper called the Maritime Labor Herald. In its very first issue, he had this to say. He said that the workers of his day, quote, produce a great deal more wealth than the wage they receive from their labor will enable them to buy back. There are more ships, more engines, more steel products, more food and clothing than is needed, but these things are in the hands of capitalists who cannot sell them, and because the workers are unemployed, they cannot buy the food and clothing they so badly need. These conditions of shortage obtain in countries that have protection and in countries that have free trade. Capitalism and capitalism alone is the evil tree that bears such fruit. So I'll give J.B. McLaughlin the last word. He was right in 1921 and he's right today.
Great. It's a good final thought. Bill, do you want to make any closing remarks, respond to the question?
Sure, yeah. Really briefly, because I think, you know, people have covered things so well and I don't have much to add, but you know, on the question of nationalism, it's something that we all have to deal with, right? You know, it's a continuing issue in various ways. And I guess I agree that the anti-free trade movement in the 80s and early 90s was a kind of weak nationalism, as Marjorie has said. Like left nationalism is a weak nationalism compared to chauvinistic right-wing nationalism. It's not my country right or wrong. It's a different kind of nationalism. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. But I guess my criticism, and it's a gentle criticism, because I think it's not easy to bring people together into a big room, as Paul was saying. And that was very much the urgent task in the struggle against the free trade agreements. But I think these were teachable moments, and I think one of the things that didn't really happen to a great extent, and could have to a greater extent than it did, is discussing capitalism and the capitalist class, and these kinds of issues that were actually front and center in the free trade, in the actual what was at stake in the free trade agreements. This is why the Business Council on National Issues was one of the prime movers, right? And generally that wasn't really profiled as strongly as I think it should have been. Rather, the discourse was very much Canada and the Americans and this kind of thing. So, the national categories that are part of nationalism, right, as a way of thinking, tended to predominate in the messaging. Now, the activists themselves might well have been thinking of what they were doing in different terms. And I think the messaging could have been stronger in terms of more of a socialist aspect to it. So that would be my point there. And the only other point I would make is just getting back to Daniel's intervention earlier, which is the idea of merging the LEAP manifesto and the Regina manifesto. What a great idea. We should be looking at these manifestos and thinking about, harvesting the insights and the important ideas, the normative kinds of the visions and the ideas of actually transforming what we have into something more democratic, more inclusive, more egalitarian, more empowering to people and more ecologically sane. I think these are, the Regina Manifesto has some great clauses in it. It is, of course, dated in certain ways, but it does call for public control of the financial sector, for example, which is crucial, actually, to break the power of capital. Of course, I think, from our perspective in the early 21st century, we can see that what needs to happen when things are brought under public control is a much deeper process of democratization than has been the case. It's not a matter of simply setting up another crown corporation. I think of a corporation out here like BC Hydro that's publicly owned and has a commercial mandate that simply, its public interest mandate is very much secondary to its commercial mandate. And so it doesn't really function particularly differently from a private corporation. And that is a big problem. So, it is, I think these manifestos are useful and we should really look to them and look to their insights, but in some cases we need to modernize. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Bill. And Claude, do you
Yes, I'll be brief because there's a supper waiting for me and a very good glass of wine, red wine. So, okay, I just want to say that you talk a lot about the LEAP manifesto, but I really suggest you to take a look on Quebec Zen. It's very, very comprehensive and it's very interesting too. So if you have the opportunity to take a look at this, I think it should be interesting. And yeah, what I want to say is I want to thank Chris and Benjamin for organizing this. It was very interesting dialogue. And I just want to say that in April 2024 in Quebec, we will commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Quebec summit in 2001. So we'll do some interesting outside even to this, and it's a way to continue this very, very interesting reflection. So thank you very much for organizing this and inviting me. So goodbye.
Thanks, Claude. And I look forward to seeing that event. One thing that we realized as we started this whole project was that this is just the beginning of a longer conversation that a lot of people, I think, feel needs to happen, right? And it's great to be revisiting these issues. And as we do, I think you come to realize just how timely and important they are. So I hope that we can continue the conversation and in different venues, different forums, and we can keep speaking to people and hearing about their stories. There were a lot of people in the chat that had a lot of experiences in the free trade struggles, and I think it's important for people to be sharing these kinds of stories. So we hope to continue this on our end too, and speak to more people about these issues. That's all I wanted to say. Ben, do you have any final comments that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for those of you who joined us today. This is a really enlightening conversation. I've learned a lot. And thank you for joining us on your Friday evenings. I know you got some glasses of wine waiting to go and some dinners to be eaten. And just a big thank you. Like Chris said, this is really kind of a beginning for us. That's how we're viewing it. And we really hope to reach out to some more people who participated today, who were involved in some of the struggles starting back in the 1980s. And so thank you to the audience for your really interesting questions. And once again, thank you so much to Marjorie, Paul, Bill, and Claude. You guys were wonderful, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, everyone. And I hope you all have a good weekend.
The wine awaits. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.